Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you everyone for coming to this session. The previous speaker, Tim, isn't his story incredible? I started to tear up near the end because a lot of what he was saying actually resonated with the participants that have been involved in my study, and so it was almost as if I was rehearing their words again. So the topic that I'm specifically going to talk about today related to young onset Parkinson's disease is how these individuals, maybe some of the people in the audience have young onset Parkinson's, but how at least the group of people that I spoke to through the research I've conducted managed uncertainty in their lives, because it was certainly a central component of what they were dealing with on a day-to-day basis. Now, before I get started, I do want to acknowledge the support that I've received from the Parkinson Society Canada, as well as the Parkinson Society Southwestern Ontario, and the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. Just a quick outline of what I'm going to go over today. I know we've seen overviews of Parkinson's disease already a few times today, but I'm just going to briefly outline it and then be able then to discuss what young onset Parkinson's disease is in contrast to regular onset or later onset Parkinson's. I'll provide an overview of the specific study that I'll be talking about and then provide an overview of the results before getting into a discussion, because I don't want to just stand up here and tell all of you about what I found, because I really consider myself in many ways to be a storyteller of other people's lives and experiences. And so if there are people who want to share their own experiences related to uncertainty, then there'll be an opportunity at the end of the presentation for that. All right, so Parkinson's disease versus young onset Parkinson's disease. Well, as we all know, Parkinson's disease is a progressive neurological disease, and so it causes progressive functional decline over time. And as has been noted a number of times today, that loss of function is the result of the loss of dopamine-producing cells. And treatment for Parkinson's, because we don't currently have a cure yet, is really focused on medication and rehabilitation strategies. And so there's motor symptoms and non-motor symptoms that define Parkinson's disease. The mnemonic that's often used to remember what the cardinal symptoms are, if you've heard it before, is TRAP. So it stands for tremor, rigidity, akinesia, or the absence or slow movement, as well as postural instability. And the non-motor symptoms, there really isn't a good way to remember them all because there's so many of them. And we saw that again in a presentation earlier today, but something that I've come up with that helps me remember, and hopefully will help you remember as well, is SCAN. So it stands for sleep and sensory issues, as well as cognitive issues, autonomic dysfunction, so again, bowel and bladder difficulties can occur, as well as neuropsychiatric difficulties, so things like anxiety and depression. Now, the thing to keep in mind is, of course, that we can talk about all of these symptoms, but Parkinson's disease is a very heterogeneous disease, which means that two people with Parkinson's disease may have very different symptoms. They're not all going to develop these symptoms. They're not all going to have them to the same degree if they are present. So it's something to keep in mind, and was certainly, again, something that I'll speak to later, that participants in my study really took some strength in knowing that all of these things that they were reading weren't necessarily going to happen to them, and really tried to have more of a positive outlook when reading about Parkinson's disease. So if that's Parkinson's disease, then how do we distinguish young onset Parkinson's? And so there's key differences, one of the most obvious being in the age of onset. So generally speaking, an individual is considered to have young onset Parkinson's disease if they were diagnosed between the ages of 21 and 55. If they were diagnosed before the age of 21, then they're considered to have juvenile onset Parkinson's disease, which is a more rare type, even more rare than young onset Parkinson's. And after 55, it's generally considered when the regular onset form of Parkinson's disease occurs. So that's the most obvious difference. But there's also differences in the physical experience of the disease as well. So with respect to young onset Parkinson's, it is slower progressing than the later onset or the regular onset subtype. And we also know that, generally speaking, younger people are more sensitive to dopaminergic medication, which leads to higher rates of dyskinesia, that side effect of the excess movement from too much dopamine being in the central nervous system. Now, the greatest area of difference for young onset Parkinson's disease occurs with respect to the psychosocial experience. Because of the age at which these individuals have been diagnosed, there's certain experiences in their lives that do create more difficulties in comparison to when someone is diagnosed later in life. And so employment is certainly one of those things that can be disrupted. And the literature, there's very little literature that actually talks about how long individuals with Parkinson's will remain employed, but generally speaking, the few studies that have been done have basically identified an average of around 10 years after the point of diagnosis. But we have to keep in mind that that is an average, and there's certainly going to be people who stay employed much longer than that. Family life can also be disrupted. Individuals with young onset Parkinson's tend to have greater marital difficulties, as well as difficulties in sometimes explaining the diagnosis to children, and because of that, having more difficulties again with the behaviors of their children. Stigmatization. There's also research indicating that individuals with young onset Parkinson's, because it's something that's typically associated with old age, feel greater stigmatization in terms of having this disease. And depression as well, both in terms of comparing the rate of depression to other individuals living with Parkinson's, as well as the general population. Those with young onset Parkinson's tend to have greater rates of depression. And all of these things collectively lead to greater declines in quality of life. So this is something that I got involved with during my undergraduate degree. I actually worked with Dr. Quincy Almeida at the MDRC for a while, and got really interested in trying to better understand the experiences of younger adults living with Parkinson's disease, because we know these things. We know that life is much more difficult. We know a little bit about differences with respect to the physical experience, but it's really the quality of life piece that at the end of the day is going to be what makes the most difference in a person's life. All right, so what did I do with respect to this study? Well, the study that I'm going to be presenting to you today is essentially some of the work that I did for my PhD. And the purpose of the study was to understand how, as well as why, individuals living with young onset Parkinson's disease actually acquired health information related to their disease over time. And there's a real important implication to this, in that it can help to address how healthcare professionals and others involved in providing care to those living with the disease can actually better provide education to those living with young onset Parkinson's, because it's usually one of the first things that people will tell me when I start asking them about their experience is how very little information they were actually told when they were diagnosed from their healthcare professional. And so because of that, it often leads to people going out and searching for things on their own, and not necessarily fully understanding what they're reading or how to interpret what they're reading, and that can, of course, lead to more difficulties. So that was the purpose, and the purpose actually ended up changing a little bit because of what I was finding. So I originally sought out looking at information seeking, and I identified that the relationship to how people were seeking out health information related to young onset Parkinson's was very closely related to how they were adjusting emotionally, as well as in a logical sense, to living with the disease. And this was all part of different strategies that individuals were using to build their resilience to living with the disease. So information seeking was only one of multiple strategies that individuals were using. And so we're going to talk about some of those other strategies as well as the information seeking. So I only have one slide on methodology because I don't want to get bogged down in terminology. But essentially, the methodology I used is called grounded theory. And I liken the methods used in grounded theory to thinking about how a tree grows. And so all of the data that I'm collecting are really considered to be part of the root system of a tree. And the actual branches and leaves of the tree are what is being developed out of that data that I'm collecting. So the data that you're collecting is very much grounded, the theory that you're developing is very much grounded in the data that's being collected. So what data did I collect? I worked with 39 individuals living with young onset Parkinson's, and over the course of 2 years conducted multiple in-depth interviews with them. I also created an online discussion board where we continued on discussions related to the project on that discussion board, and also held multiple focus groups as well. So it was a very in-depth collection of data with those 39 individuals. And one of the other things that I did just to try to get a more diverse sample was I looked at 14 different autobiographies that have been written by individuals living with young onset Parkinson's, and also extracted data out of those related to how individuals were talking about health information and other strategies that they were using to build resilience to what they were experiencing. And just one little note about the analysis process, so how I actually moved from collecting all that data to generating the theory. In grounded theory, essentially it's different levels of coding. And so with coding, you have an initial level, and then you have a focused level, and then a more theoretical level. And each subsequent level of coding, you are building up the significance of what it is that you're finding. So you're trying to identify themes and then look at relationships of themes to other themes, and really identify, again, what the most important aspects of what it is that you're collecting are. All right, so now to the results. So as you might have concluded from the title of my presentation, Managing Uncertainty in Young Onset Parkinson's Disease, the main reason why individuals talked about collecting health information was to manage the uncertainty that they experienced with respect to living with young onset Parkinson's. And they experienced uncertainty in two veins. They experienced uncertainty with respect to their functioning, and so that they experienced uncertainty in terms of the symptoms that they would experience, because again, the heterogeneous nature of the disease meant that they can read all about the condition, but they don't necessarily know what symptoms they're going to develop, as well as progression. Very little is written about how the disease is going to progress, because it's so different from one person to the next. So there's uncertainty that individuals are trying to manage with right from the point of diagnosis around what their functioning is going to be, as well as changes even during the day. Many of the people that I spoke to did experience the great fluctuations in motor functioning throughout the day between medication dosages, and so there was uncertainty in terms of how they actually were going to experience the day right at that level. And this was often expressed in terms of talking about having good days as well as having bad days. And that it's actually something that has come up a lot in the chronic illness literature, this distinction between good and bad days, but is, again, evidence that individuals experience this great uncertainty in terms of their functioning. And so this is just a quote from one of the participants. Is it going to get worse? My biggest fear is probably my mobility. The one big thing that scares me is the mobility. Am I going to start falling down? Am I going to be able to walk properly? I don't know how my body will go, but the fear of the unknown, where am I going to be 5 years from now? And this is from a participant who was just diagnosed within the last 2 years. So again, really speaking to that uncertainty in terms of their function. The other point of uncertainty that they experienced was with respect to their identity, because again, we're talking about young and middle-aged adults having something that is typically associated with older age. And so there was uncertainty with respect to their employment, whether or not they were going to be able to continue to work. Uncertainty in terms of their family life. How is this going to affect my relationship with my wife and kids, or my husband and kids? As well as a fear of eventually becoming dependent on other people. And so certainly in our society, we highly value independence and staying independent. And so there was this fear as part of their identity that they might eventually become dependent on other people. And so this is just, again, a quote to help illustrate that. I want to know what my life is going to be like when I'm 10 years down the road, 15 years down the road, what I should expect. Should I expect to be living on my own? You know, those types of things. They shake me up a bit, because I hate thinking that I'd be dependent on somebody. But that's really the key thing, is what dependence is going to be like. Answer is, they don't know. And so one of the things that I noticed as people were talking about all of these uncertainty aspects of their life is the relationship between how they also were feeling emotionally. And so they talked about having reduced control over their lives and having increased grief. So there was a lot of anger and depression at certain points in their experience. But of course, the main theme that I was talking about, or that came out of my research, is managing uncertainty. So that's the uncertainty that they experience, but how is it that individuals actually try to manage and overcome this uncertainty in their life? And so all individuals eventually talked about either developing resilient strategies or talking about different processes of adjusting to the disease. And so these two concepts were very closely related to one another. And what the adjustment process did is it helped to manage with the grief that they were dealing with. And what the resilient strategies did is it helped to return control to their lives, or a sense of being in control over their lives. And so specifically talking about the adjustment process, there was two different types of adjustment that people spoke about. There was a logical adjustment process as well as an emotional adjustment process, because young onset Parkinson's disease and Parkinson's disease generally is a progressive condition. So it's hard to speak about adjusting completely to something that is always has the potential for change. Now, what logical adjustment, what was meant by that is the conclusion or the realization that, yes, I do have Parkinson's disease. And it took some individuals a long time to actually accept that they did have young onset Parkinson's disease, despite all the evidence from maybe one or two physicians or what they were reading. It took a lot of convincing on their part that they actually had Parkinson's disease. But once they came to that conclusion, that's when the emotional adjustment process started. And that emotional adjustment process, again, was ongoing. And so essentially what this graph is illustrating is that change in adjustment, both from a logical point of view and an emotional point of view. And so there was logical denial as well as logical acceptance, and emotional denial and emotional acceptance. And so most people started off talking about some form of logical denial, again, where they didn't necessarily believe, based on the evidence being presented to them, that they had Parkinson's disease. But as they came to that realization, that's when they were confronted again with all of the emotions of now accepting this reality that this is a disease that I have. And one of the defining questions that helped to distinguish when individuals actually started into this emotional adjustment process was when they started asking that question, why me? Because it signified that now they actually are accepting from a logical point of view that they have the disease, but they haven't started emotionally to adjust or to manage with it. And so this is just another quote from a participant in the study. The second denial was after the actual confirmation of the diagnosis, and that was more of an emotional denial. I mean, mentally, and I guess from a factual point of view, I knew that I had Parkinson's disease, but I wasn't emotionally ready to accept it. So that was a different kind of denial. And the emotional adjustment process, as I alluded to, is really ongoing. It never ends because it's a progressive condition, so it's something where every time that there's a new change, it may require a subsequent adjustment. But that's the adjustment process, and what I wanted to focus on for the rest of the presentation was how people actually spoke about building resilience in their lives to these difficulties that they were experiencing. And again, these resilient strategies that I'm going to speak about were used to bolster feelings of control in one's life. So there were internal strategies as well as external strategies, and the one thing that I had originally sought out looking at in this study was how individuals learned about Parkinson's disease. So with respect to internal, and this is just indicating that, again, these strategies were what was used by individuals during that emotional adjustment process. But the internal strategies that people spoke about using included things like social comparison. So individuals would find it beneficial to compare Parkinson's disease to things that they perceived to be worse, whether it was having MS or a brain tumor or Huntington's disease. They found that those were types of things, if they were able to minimize the severity of the diagnosis, that it was able to help them in some way. And social comparisons also occurred with respect to comparing themselves to other people that they knew who also had Parkinson's disease. So if they were able to see, for example, that they didn't have a specific type of symptom or they weren't as far along in the progression of the disease, then that was also something that helped them really form or reform beliefs about being in control of the disease. They also talked about changing their time perspective, changing from a focus on the future to a focus on the present and being present. Because, again, the future was a source of uncertainty. They didn't know what was going to happen down the road in terms of their functioning. And so in order to take back control in their lives, they talked about focusing on the now. And a lot of people, as an example, spoke about this idea of getting to their bucket list sooner. So there was a compression of time, so to speak, where they wanted to focus on what was important now as opposed to putting it off because the future, again, was uncertain. And spirituality. This was something, again, Tim had mentioned too, and not that everyone spoke about spirituality, but some people found real comfort in thinking about spirituality and moving back to spirituality and their faith as a way, again, to increase their beliefs about being in control of their life. So those were different internal strategies, and external strategies included some creative things like writing, actually getting out their thoughts and their feelings, externalizing those negative thoughts, and either writing poetry or blogs, or in some cases, as I talked about, I included autobiographies as a source of data. So there's people who have written autobiographies about their about their story with young onset Parkinson's. As well as another strategy, which was pruning negative relationships from their life. And this was talked about in terms of having certain people in their lives who were weighing them down because of the complaints that they had that really seemed quite small in comparison to what they were dealing with in their own life. And so because of the amount of energy and the amount of both mental and physical energy that these individuals felt they felt that it was better to actually end those relationships with people who were weighing them down and taking up too much of their physical and mental energy. And certainly one of the main things that individuals did was draw on social supports, whether that was one-on-one with other people living with either a disability or with Parkinson's disease, drawing on the Parkinson Society, drawing on support groups, for example, of other individuals living with young onset Parkinson's disease. And again, the main thing that I started out looking at was how individuals actually learned about Parkinson's disease. And so just as a quick summary of the work that I did in this area, some individuals came to the Parkinson's diagnosis with an existing knowledge base about the disease. We talked about, or Tim talked about being a nurse and how he already knew from a factual point of view that tremor in his toe meant one of two things. But a lot of the other participants in my study also, for various reasons, whether it's a family member or their education, had some prior knowledge about Parkinson's disease. And in many ways, that helped to alleviate the difficulty in initially managing with the disease when they had some idea of what it is that they were going to be dealing with. And then I apologize for the complex or the abstract terms here. I'll describe them. But so in addition to having that recalled knowledge after the diagnosis, there was the acquired knowledge. So knowledge that people came to acquire after their diagnosis. And that came from both extant as well as elicited sources. Extant sources are things like books and web pages that you can't interact with. They're just information that exists, and you can read it, but you can't ask it any questions. So elicited sources of information are referring to those sources like other people, or perhaps online support groups, or other things like your healthcare professional who you can actually interact with and ask direct questions to. And that information was acquired both actively, so individuals could actively seek that out, as well as passively, so they could receive it more by chance as opposed to receiving it as a direct motivation to find that information. And all of this, the recalled as well as the acquired knowledge, were combined into basically an individual's accumulated knowledge base at a specific point in time in their experience living with the disease. And what the participants spoke about is actually using that information that they had acquired and filtered it through their own experience. So just because they learned, for example, that yoga was something that a lot of people were benefiting from, they didn't necessarily take that at face value. They went out and tried it, and through trial and error and experimentation came to see whether or not that was something that also helped them. And so through that bodily experience, they converted this accumulated knowledge base to what I referred to as an experiential knowledge base. Now, also with respect to learning about information, there was a big trend that we were able to identify in terms of different types of information that were perceived to be most beneficial as the adjustment process, as a person moved through the adjustment process. So we have general information seeking and specific information seeking, and the use of extant sources of information and the use of elicited sources of information. And basically what the trend was, or what we found, is that early after the diagnosis, when individuals were starting to look for information, So really during that logical adjustment period, more information was coming from extant sources, so sources like websites or pamphlets or books, and less information coming from talking to other people. And most of that information was general in nature, so trying to focus on what the symptoms were, what the causes were, what the progression might be like. And over time, as individuals started that emotional adjustment process, that's when things started to shift, where the topics of information became much more specific. So now I'm dealing with a sleeping problem, so now I'm going to go out and focus on sleep, or those types of issues. And as I mentioned, the type of information sources that were being used were more from other people living with the disease and from healthcare professionals, as opposed to those extant types of information like books and websites. So that's a brief overview of what I found, but I know that there's lots of other experiences out there beyond what the 39 individuals in my study had. And so I was curious how it is, in terms of what I just presented to you, how that relates to your experience with finding information related to Parkinson's disease. So I'll turn it over to you, and you can tell me now a little bit about your experience. Do we have a microphone? Okay, great.
I don't have a question regarding myself. My husband has been diagnosed.
Mm-hmm.
My question regarding my son. What are the chances? Is there distance as to the chance that one of them having experienced Parkinson?
Well, there's different types of Parkinson's disease, and so it would depend on the type that your husband has, so whether there is a family history or not. Okay. Then basically, if the family history is unknown, the safest thing to say is that it's really a combination between genetics and environmental factors. So your sons would have to be exposed to certain environmental factors that might cause the gene to actually express the disease. But certainly it doesn't mean having a parent or a family member with the disease does not mean at all that someone is going to develop the disease, because the genetic linkage, although there is a genetic linkage, isn't as strong as other diseases where it does travel through generations. You're welcome. Any other questions or comments, I guess, related to finding information? Yep. Yeah.
I'm a star. A group of people that talk about it, I find it very beneficial, and I try to convince people that I know with Parkinson's to do so.
Yeah.
It's quite beneficial for everybody to sit down and, it's an hour and a half, or some of them have them in the afternoons or evenings or whatever, but to join some group in your town or area that you can express your feelings and
Yep.
see what other people are doing and what's happening.
Yeah, absolutely. And as I described, really in the later stages, once individuals are talking about emotionally adjusting with the disease, that's the type of information sources that became the most important, was talking to other people living with the disease.
Even though people don't want to talk about it, I mean, they might as well, because that's what it is.
Yeah, yeah. Any other comments or questions related to information? We have one at the back.
I agree with getting support. We have a very good support group in London, Ontario, and if it wasn't for that, I don't know how I would be dealing with this. First time I went, I was scared. I had no idea what I was walking into. but it was the best thing I did because I've developed friendships. I've been involved in a lot more things like committees, and it's just all around been beneficial.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm becoming a caregiver, and at this point, I'm part-time taking care of a friend that has Parkinson disease. He was diagnosed 5 years ago, and I'm learning with him because, to tell you the truth, the information is not readily available, especially for younger people with the disease. He was diagnosed when he was 52. And so he had to quit working. He's on disability, and there's a lot of stigma. Being a man, the first thing he worried was about his sexual activity. And also there is a lot of too much information that is not certain. There is the alternative medicine. There is all these researches that are not definite, and it's like trial and error. Some of them are, but then there's all these surgeries proposals, and none of them will say that they'll cure the disease. And that's another lack of information we found, is what causes the disease. There's a lot of talk about how to deal with the symptoms and stop the symptoms, but how do you get there, and why is it on an increase? Why is it that more young people are getting the disease?
Yeah.
And there is almost no information in regards to that.
Yes, it's when you go and try to find information about Parkinson's, you're bombarded with a wealth of websites, and sometimes people trying to sell miracle cures, and it's hard to tell what's good from what's bad. And certainly one of the things that I certainly endorse and that my participants spoke about is really relying as much as you can on your healthcare team. Maybe in some cases not the doctor if you don't have a lot of time with the doctor, but there's certainly nurses, occupational therapists, physiotherapists that can all help you filter through that information when you do have questions about it. You talked about the information around causes and not really being able to identify the cause of Parkinson's, and that's because there's really, again, different types of Parkinson's, but for the most part, we can't identify any one single cause. It's usually a combination, again, of having a genetic predisposition with factors within the environment that are causing the disease, whether that be pesticides or certain occupations like being a farmer, for example, that is exposing a person to a greater risk of the disease. But thank you for your comment. Yep, lots more questions. Over on the side here.
I was diagnosed 4 months ago with Parkinson's, and I was in denial, and I was diagnosed at St. Mary's Hospital, and they got an opening for me in Freeport Hospital. I went there for 8 weeks, twice a week, for therapy, and they did wonders, and they explained to me about Parkinson's. I had no knowledge. I was in denial, and they were showing me what to do, the exercises, the routine, the voice, and everything else. And I am now a believer in Parkinson's. And it was because of these people, and they have helped me. And from the first time I went in to after the 8 weeks, I graduated, and they said what a miracle they seen in me and what a change. I was really pleased that I was able to get into this course.
That's
program at Freeport Hospital. And there was just an opening for me when they sent me.
That's fantastic that it helped you really work through that denial, because it's not until after you're able to work through that denial that some growth can come through the experience in terms of trying to find new roles and trying to find meaning in the experience that might otherwise drag you down into depression and anger. A comment over here?
I just have a comment. I just find it very concerning that once a diagnosis is actually made, that there isn't any type of referral or anything given to persons who have just been diagnosed.
Yeah.
There doesn't appear to be any connect between the people who do the diagnosis to the next step where people can actually begin to get that information for themselves.
Yeah.
And so I think a lot of people go to these extant sources for information simply because that's the only place at this point in time that they can get that initial information.
Yeah.
And I think that there really needs to be something put into the healthcare system itself that actually says, once this diagnosis is made, this is the next step that you actually go to. So for this gentleman here that got through St. Mary's Hospital, to go through that course is a fantastic thing. But I don't know why that's not put into every single neurology office or any doctor's office, that as soon as that diagnosis is made, that you do get to go into those other courses. So is there anything that Parkinson's Society or someone that is available like that could sort of push towards that?
Rose would like to answer that question. And
That's an awesome question, because it's a huge problem. And by huge problem, that is a gap in the system that needs to not only be identified, be tabled, but have something done about it. So I'm not sure about your experience, Mike, but what I've done in the last couple of months is start working with one of the Western Gerontology in Practice is what it's called. Western University has a course that's community engaged learning. So I have 6 students trying to help with that very problem, where I'm trying to say, if I have a client calling me and saying, I've had Parkinson's for 1 year, 2, 6 years, 10 years, and this is the first time I'm calling, that's not okay. That's way too long. So these students are helping try to solve the problem, mind you, albeit in a semester. So they've been surveying, I'm not sure if anyone here has received calls, but they've been surveying both early onset and young onset clients in rural and urban areas, and also MDs as well as neurologists and movement disorder specialists, again, in urban and rural areas. So what we've identified over the last 7 weeks is that there isn't seemingly an importance factor on the neurology/movement disorder specialist side, where I talked to Dr. Connolly today as well, but ultimately it's a need to identify that it is concerning and that is part of their job. So we've essentially created a do you have Parkinson's, a very simple flyer as a starting point. And the end of this project with these students, we're mailing this flyer out to every single MD and neurologist office in southwestern Ontario. So that's over 1,000 contacts.
Yeah.
That's something.
that's fantastic. And I know in the research that I've done, one of the things that came out of this that we have actually produced are booklets for healthcare professionals. And one of the things that those booklets do is they drive home the importance of understanding that they are really the gatekeeper to health information, and they need to be providing that information from the time of diagnosis, and not, again, putting it off to other people to necessarily explain what the disease is or where they can find credible information. I saw your...
But you'd think, though, Mike, that when somebody's at least it irritates the heck out of me. If somebody's diagnosed and handed a script, that person should also be given, here is something else for when you're ready. There, you can go to this. You can go to this source.
Yeah.
Right.
Exactly.
And I find it very irritating as well, and that it needs to stop. That said, I'm sorry, I'm not trying to bah, but basically, we have to get on the map. People are sitting at home, not putting up flyers, not helping with the distribution of this. I can't do it alone. Mike can't do it alone. Steve can't do it alone. Really, I have to say, I want to push the onus back on everyone else that's saying, what are we going to do about it? Do something. Let's talk about it and have it happen.
Thank you, Rose.
Sorry.
Dee?
Grr. Rock steady boxing, what?
Just is, if I just may add for somebody else's, my experience, I'm helping the man that I'm helping, he hardly speaks English. Just to put it in perspective, he's alone here in Canada. His relatives are all out. They cannot come here. They cannot help him out. He's renting a space in somebody's living room. And as I try to, because he's getting depressed, there is no help out there. Like the doctors don't know, the association doesn't know. How can I find, for example, a place for him to live with his disease? Mm-hmm. I'm not with him full time. He's able to move right now. He's able to cook by himself, but I'm thinking in the future, it's where the conditions that he's at is they're not conducive to getting better.
Yeah.
And all I can do is get him involved in music programs because he's a musician, try to get him to do exercise, but nobody knows where can I find a place for him to live where he doesn't have to deal with 3 other men, in his case, turning the TV on at 12 o'clock when he wants to sleep, like things like that. And I'm talking about one case, and I'm sure there are many others similar or people that don't have relatives to take care of them, and there's no information.
But this is a great scenario where you could potentially call the Parkinson Society Southwestern Ontario office. Have you tried?
Yes, I have.
You've tried.
And that's why I'm here at this conference, trying to find out if there is other resources.
Yeah.
They don't know. What they did is actually, when he himself approached the Parkinson Society, they sent him to a senior citizens place where they started sending him dinners that he didn't ask for, thinking that he was incapable. They sent him to senior programs where, they're beneficial, but people are talking about the grandchildren where he has a 14-year-old child. There's different issues that he's dealing with. And
I do have a few other suggestions, but I can mention to you after. Are there any other questions that people have just to finish up? Questions or comments? All right. Well, thank you very much for your time and for your attention. And hopefully you learned a little bit more about information seeking in young onset Parkinson's disease. And thank you as well for the discussion.